You're listening to Frontier Matters, the podcast from 1914 Reader. Join us as we dive into bold conversations on growth and change in the frontier economies of the world.
Our guest today has spent years showing that Nigerian food is not simply something to eat, but something to study. She was born in Warri, studied geology in the UK, and worked as a geologist for 20 years before becoming one of the most careful chroniclers of Nigerian food. Since launching Kitchen Butterfly in 2009, she has built the New Nigerian Kitchen, Nigeria's first seasonal produce calendar, and the Feast Afrique digital archive. Her debut cookbook, Chop Chop, which I'm proud to own a copy of here, Cooking the Food of Nigeria, gathers 100 recipes from across the country's 6 geopolitical regions, alongside their ingredients, history, and cultural context. Today, we want to look behind the recipes. What does the scientific training allow you to see in food? Ozo Soko, welcome to Frontier Matters.
Thank you very much, Faye. I'm happy to be here.
Great. Okay, so I'll start with your route into food, which is a bit unusual. You studied urban and regional planning at University of Ife. You moved to the UK and you studied geology. And you said that it was in the UK that you fell in love with chemistry. So before food entered the picture professionally, what did geology train you to notice? And what part of that training do you still apply in your cooking today?
Geology opened up my eyes to the connection between land and food. I learned about how soil type, different types of soil support different crops, but also the way that water and soil impact the kind of things that shape tastes. And I'd love to give a Nigerian example, but the best example I have is of how the topography, the geography, and the geology of Japan shapes some of its fundamental recipes, shapes how the kind of water, hard water, soft water, impacts the ingredients that are used to make stocks like dashi, and how that underpins kind of like the essence of Japanese culture and cuisine. And I'm still kind of researching what that means, like how those elements apply in the context of Nigerian cuisine. But it's not as documented as the case of Japan. But I think for me, geology and scientific training allows you observe. I would be out in the fields with my notebook, my camera, looking at mountains, looking at rocks. And I couldn't bring back the mountain with me, but I could bring back photos of the mountains. I could look at rock samples. I could observe basic sensory things, the color, the smell, the texture, the sound, the feeling. And with those observations, I could then go back home, look through my notes, read papers, look in books, talk to people, and come up with theories. So just that observation, the being able to see and not necessarily interpret while out on the field, but being able to make notes that you could then use to build theories and other things.
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, you said you began cooking Nigerian food in Britain, partly. Sorry, we'll come back to geology a bit more, but you said you began cooking Nigerian food in Britain partly as an answer to homesickness. I'm sure a lot of Nigerians abroad will relate to that. When you were trying to recreate a taste from home, was your kitchen kind of like a laboratory where you tried out experiments to get the taste? Or was this effort mostly about trying to find the best available ingredient? So, I mean, what took your energy the most, sort of?
Taste was always preeminent. It was like, I want to make this how I remembered my mom making it or my dad making it. And there was something about the memory of taste that was at the fore. But there was also undeniably working with new ingredients, right? Ingredients that weren't quite as I was familiar with. And so kind of having to make substitutes, understanding what the Nigerian ingredient was, understanding what the substitute was, and figuring out a way to make sure that I got the same taste results that I wanted by tweaking. And those are things that I really enjoyed. Like even in the midst of using, different kind of pepper to Nigerian tatashe, for instance, it was like, oh, wow, there's this similarity across cultures, across cuisines. And I found that and still find it really, really exciting and intriguing. But taste was definitely the thing of primary importance.
And what was the thing that sort of like living outside Nigeria surfaced the most? So maybe something you had taken for granted while in Nigeria, and then, you know, all of a sudden now you have a very different view of it by living abroad.
Stew, Nigerian stew. When you go to the market in Nigeria to buy tomatoes, those tomatoes haven't started off life green. They haven't gone into a freezer. They aren't artificially ripened. So there's something about the texture, something about the flavor. And you're not figuring out how to get the best out of them. They've already started in a place of strength. And I think just making a good pot of stew became a very, very critical thing. The tomatoes, the onions, red onions. I was a student. Red onions were typically slightly more expensive than white onions. And I grew up using red onions or purple onions in Nigeria. And so, you're wondering if, the fact that one ingredient is different will impact the outcome. So again, I was in this space where I was missing Nigerian food, but also contending with being a student, broke often, being
course.
homesick, but also learning to acculturate, learning about what it meant to be Nigerian living abroad as a 20-something-year-old. So there's so many things that are then also competing for your attention in the kitchen. And I feel like as a Nigerian, I'd taken things for granted. I felt like because I'd witnessed people cooking stew my whole life and I'd maybe made it a few times, that I could make a good pot. But then you quickly learn that there are many steps and it's something that takes time, that needs crafting. And so, you're forced to slow down and learn again. It almost felt
All
like
over again.
retraining, like learning how to do these things on my own instead of under the auspices or covering of family members.
That's
So,
interesting. I mean, the point you made, it reminds me of, so I had a friend, well, many years ago now, but he was Italian, came from an Italian family, and they grew tomatoes here in the UK. But I think, obviously they grew in greenhouse, but what I found interesting was that pretty much the entire thing was dictated by supermarkets, right? So, he was selling to maybe Sainsbury's or Marks and Spencer, and they specified exactly how they wanted their tomatoes, which might be because they sold salads and all that kind of stuff. So, your point about Nigerian, I mean, you could just, I think those things, it's not something you probably think about, but just as you mentioned it, I thought, okay, taking tomatoes that were crafted for maybe salads and then trying to make a pot of stew, might force you to slow down and think differently. Okay. Interesting. Anyway,
especially if you're not expecting that.
exactly.
You're not expecting that you're going to go to the market and find so many different varieties of a thing. Yeah.
Right. On Kitchen Butterfly, you once described your method as hypothesis, experiment, and then present findings, So I mean, talk me through a kitchen butterfly recipe development cycle. What happens between the first idea and then the final version you eventually put out there for people?
Even before I go into the kitchen, I spend a lot of time thinking about the recipe and sometimes tasting. I can taste food in my head. Right? So if I
I know
sometimes
what you
it's
mean.
like, yeah, but long before I go into the kitchen, I write up a recipe. I write the key ingredients, general proportions, and then just kind of figure out what it is I'm trying to accomplish and what question I'm trying to answer. Usually all of my ventures, all of my recipe development is hinged on a particular question. It might be one about taste, it might be texture, it might be aesthetics. Um, for instance, right now I'm thinking about making a particular cookie, and I wanted to have, you know, I wanted to have a particular texture. I'm going to use oats in it, and so I'll write that recipe, and then the next part for me, which is really exciting, is going grocery shopping. It's going to, a market, going to a grocery store and figuring out, well, get the specific ingredient that I want. I'll write up the recipe, I'll write up methods, and then I'll go into the kitchen with my notebook or my computer or my phone pretty much these days. And I will begin the recipe making. I'll take photos of each step because I think that can be helpful. And in lieu of writing down timings, I use the timestamps on my photos to kind of help me figure out how long I spent on a particular step. And then I'll make the recipe and typically have myself and my children, who are young adults, taste. And everyone will give feedback, and I'll kind of evaluate the outcome against my original goal. And then continue tweaking. I'm the kind of person who will make one recipe 100 times. So for instance, I'm still always kind of tweaking my recipe for jollof rice. I'm still always kind of adjusting the timings and realizing, if I, just different things.
Which was a
But
more
I'm
perfect jollof
definitely
rice. Yeah.
a constant, and what's that thing? There's a Japanese Kaizen, I think it is. This constant and never-ending improvement journey, but it's pretty much like an experiment.
Yeah. So I was going to say, I mean, which of your experiments has produced a result that genuinely surprised you?
Hmm. Experiments. That's a. I'm gonna have to think about that one. But I think the recipe. I think of jollof rice as being akara. Akara is a recipe that surprised me. When I first started making akara at home in Nigeria, the beans were obedient. That's the only way I can think about them. I never really had problems with getting the texture right for my akara batter when I lived in Nigeria. When I moved to the Netherlands in 2007, the first time I tried to make akara, it took me like 24 hours to peel the beans because they were polished, and a kind of process that made the skins adhere to the bean itself.
Right.
So to
Okay.
take it off was
Extra.
torture. And then the beans they didn't soften as quickly as the ones in Nigeria. And so I always had issues with my batter. But in the process of redeveloping my akara recipe for Chop Chop, I realized that one way to get the right consistency was not to throw everything into the blender at the same time. That's the beans, the onions, water, pepper. Because I found out that I would add way more water to the mix and I would end up with a really light batter that just disintegrated in oil. But I realized that the onions also had water. Onions have water. And if I started off, kind of broke the blending process into a two-step one, by blending the onions and the water first, I would have enough liquid for the beans overall. But also if I added the beans in batches, so instead of adding all the clean beans at once, if I kind of added maybe half and made the puree, it was easier to incorporate the rest. So this was just, my recipe didn't change, but it was more of a sequencing of the steps in ways that honestly, I wouldn't really have even thought was worth it. Like, I would, like, why don't you just make akara? Like, put everything together. But just that simple step of making the onion puree and adding the beans in batches makes such a huge difference and gives me the consistency I want of the eventual batter. So I think that's the one.
Okay. I mean, speaking of that, you spend years experimenting with agbalumo. I mean, for non-Nigerians, this is, I think it's called African star apple. You use this acidity to make custard. Exploring the thickener and the gum in the skin. And turning the skin into bitters. And you tried it in ice cream, and jellies and all that. So, I mean, is that the clearest example of the scientist in you meeting a Nigerian ingredient?
Yes, my work with agbalumo is an almost complete expression of my approach to food and my belief. So my belief is that an ingredient is an ingredient. It doesn't have to be confined to its classic use or its pre-existing use, that you can actually explore the full range of ingredients if you think about them just as almost as a thing that can answer different questions. And so for me, when it comes to working with ingredients, I will take a fruit, a vegetable, boil it, fry it, pickle it, roast it, grill it, ferment it, freeze it to understand more about its character. I'll also try to find similarities between that ingredient and other ingredients in other cultures. I'm curious about how things with similar textures and similar characters are used in different contexts. So that kind of also feeds into my research. And then I will just go to town because for me, the strength of a culture is both keeping the pillars of the cuisine
And also
alive,
open to
as well
ideas.
as expanding the bounds of possibility. Yeah, Agbalumo has definitely trained me in many ways, and I'm still it's an ingredient I'm still excited to work with.
I mean, what have you found elsewhere that is, like, you can probably say is as close to agbalumo?
When I was growing up, we would call Agbalumo cherry. People would call it cherry. And a friend of mine who had lived in the US said that they reminded him of sour cherries. And I was like, yeah, well, agbalumo has that sweet, slightly tart, astringent flavor. And so I tried sour cherries a few years after, and I was like, yeah, there's some similarity. So I started looking at how sour cherries are used in other cultures. They're also similar star apple fruits, but they don't have the complexity of agbalumo. So there's a green one, there's a purple one. The texture of the skin is different. It's not as leathery. It's not as thick. The flesh is a lot softer, and the seeds don't have that sweet, pulpy agbalumo character. But I could see that in other cultures there. I learned from them how to cut the fruit, how to process the fruit. So when I first started working with agbalumo, I would literally peel the skins off. But I feel like it was maybe a South Asian video where they cut the fruit in half and could scoop out the flesh. And I was like, oh, that's
That
a
look
great way
familiar.
to process. In fact, I actually then did an experiment where I timed myself hand peeling agbalumo versus using the cut and scoop method. And I was like, yeah, that was definitely something I learned. There was also a Jamaican recipe where they use the star apple to make a fruit salad with oranges. And I tried that. So for me, I always have like a basic template of explorations I want to do, but I also look to other cultures, other cuisines to see what is similar and, how I might expand, experiment with, other recipes.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay. So I think one of my favorite terms you use in Chop Chop, you describe the way many Nigerians learn to cook as loose estimation. Just add a little, with measurements from the heart and, spoonfuls instead of cups, that sort of thing. You then say that experience taught you where loose estimation works and where it does not. A cookbook it demands precision, repeatability. That's why people buy them. But Nigerian home cooking often depends on quote unquote judgment.
Mm-hmm.
So how did you translate one into the other? So how did you translate without taking out the freedom of the food that people might what was that process like?
I first had to not scoff at the written recipe as being an avenue towards people understanding how to make things. I realized the privilege I have of being Nigerian and learning to cook in this intuitive way, but that's not everyone's reality, And so for me, I tried to share in the head notes, in little note boxes in the book where people could take liberties. I want people to understand that, okay, this is my experience. This is the way I ate a particular thing growing up, but you can take liberties. So where possible, I try to include examples of what that freedom of doing your own thing might look like. I try to include substitutes and examples that would give people a sense of confidence to embark on their own. But where a recipe was really important, where proportions were important, like moi moi, for instance. The ratio of liquid to beans is important for a good outcome.
Yeah.
If you want hard moi moi, and believe me, I learned this the hard way, because if you get that proportion, that ratio wrong, it's too late once the thing is in the pot, right? So you make your moi moi mix. If the mix is too liquid, it never sets. If it's too thick, you end up with a hard, firm moi moi at the end. And so in cases like that, I would state, the ratio is important and you want to keep that balance. I think it's also a way of knowing that once people try it the way it's written, in future, they're welcome to make any changes they want that suits them. But the lessons I learned the hard way were important for me to communicate so people don't end up, in that same predicament.
Yeah. Yeah. Was it difficult translating terms like Nigerian terms such as, soup, stew, and pepper? Was that difficult translating for readers who are not, who may understand them differently? I mean, soup means a different thing here in the UK, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, how did you, bridge that?
a lot of the things that I wrote in Chop Chop were concepts, thoughts, experiments, explorations that I had dealt with 10 years ago when in my early days of food writing. So they're things I'd given great thought to. And because of my work, researching and working with food, I knew Nigerian differences versus global differences. So Nigerian soup is really a stew when you look at a global culinary definition. But it was important for me that this book also spoke to Nigerians. That Nigerians, so for instance, I read a lot of egusi stew recipes, and I wasn't going to do that because egusi stew is a foreign concept to a Nigerian. It's egusi soup. I can, in the in the chapter openers, I could talk about, and I did talk about, why certain Nigerian references are a particular way. But it was also really important for me that Nigerians recognized the very Nigerian forms of speech. When I was talking about processing greens or beans, for instance, I said you wash the beans, but washing, I mean, it's not laundry. It's technically rinsing or skinning, but when a Nigerian says washing beans, we know what we mean. Washing rice, we know what we mean. So it was important for me to use those terms and have explanations as opposed to just assume a global language for it. Yeah. So context is important. And that was really interesting because my brain is very Nigerian and thinks in a Nigerian way. In fact, last week I was hosting an online cooking class and we were making Nigerian fried rice. And my audience were Puerto Ricans and Mexicans and Americans and Ethiopians. And I was like, so yes, we're going to wash the rice. And then I had to pause to explain to them. And there are a few people, there's a Puerto Rican gentleman on the call who was like, yeah, in Puerto Rico, we also say wash. Right. So that was funny and fun.
Yeah. Okay.
But you have to be conscious.
Of course, definitely. Yeah. I mean, coming back to geology briefly, your food work has similarities with geology, I mean, which you've talked about already. And you mentioned, obviously, it's a lot of field work and mapping. The seasonal produce calendar, ingredient profile, fast African, all those attempts to trace edible routes across the diaspora. What gaps in Nigerian food data have frustrated you the most? Just curious
What
about
gaps?
this. So what gaps in Nigerian food data have frustrated you the most?
Origins. Where did certain practices come from? I think that the lack of dates frustrates me. And I guess only because I've grown up seeing historians ascribe importance to older things. I'm trying to move away from that, but sometimes I'm like, how did Nigeria become a country that loves Danish butter cookies in tins? For instance, that's something I'm currently obsessed with. But when did Danish butter cookies come to Nigeria? Who has recorded
It's a good
that?
question. I mean, it's a really good question because obviously I don't know, but I know that it was a thing growing up, Yeah.
So I spend a lot of my time buying books, reading papers to have a bit more grounding on our origin stories. Because a lot of the things we take for granted today came to Nigeria in very interesting ways. Take eggs, for instance. Look, we'll find eggs in so many Nigerian dishes, used in so many ways that we might assume that Nigerians have always loved eggs and that eggs have always been part of Nigerian culture and cuisine. But that's not the case. The story of eggs in Nigeria, which I've traced using cookbooks from 1910 to date, as well as research, shows that sentiments around eggs up till about 1930 were not positive. You had sentiments of, you had a lot of writing, mostly by British colonialists, around how the eggs in Nigeria weren't really good quality. They were only useful for election egging. That, they were almost always rotten. But around the 1930s and the Great Depression, protein sources were really expensive. The League of Nations was concerned about malnutrition across British colonies. Tax regimen for foodstuffs in Nigeria is changing. British colonial governments were exporting a lot of Nigerian crops. So we're moving from a food crop kind of country to one that was largely based on cash crops. Food was becoming very expensive. And eggs were then pushed as kind of these protein saviors to take the edge off the fact that, regular protein wasn't as accessible and was way more expensive. And then you started seeing eggs feature in writing and in recipes. There's a book I love. It's called The Kudeti Book of Yoruba Cookery, and I'm looking around to see if I have a copy close by. Yes, I do. So this is a copy. I think this is a 1979 edition, but I've got a 1965 one, first written in 1934. And you'll see so many recipes for different things with eggs. There's an efo egg recipe. There's an akara egg recipe. And slowly, eggs became a fixture in Nigerian cuisine. But for me, it's like, if I hadn't read or asked these questions about how the sentiments changed between 1910 and 1930, I would just assume that this is just another everyday food that evolved. For me, there's a lot of history behind things that are common and everyday today, and that fascinates me.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, staying along the same theme, you wrote in Chop Chop that, the colonial imposition of bouillon cubes was not a benign exchange. It displaced older seasonings and agricultural practices, and diminished the documentation of traditional foods. You've also described discovering the connection between Brazilian akara and Nigerian akara, which we spoke about, as a turning point. Funny thing, anyway, I'll come back to that. But what can food reveal about historical change that conventional history books often miss? Speaking of that, I think I was speaking to Joke Bakari at Chisel a couple of, I think, months ago. She had just come back from Brazil, and she was blown away. I think she was blown away by the similarities she found between Nigerian food and I think akara was one of the. Anyway, I'll let you speak more about
So my discovering Brazilian akara changed my life. Food, particularly the language of food, leaves a lot of traces. One may not have connected Nigerian akara and Brazilian akara if the names were markedly different. Everywhere across the Black Atlantic, through transatlantic enslavement, you'll find some akara, kala, kara, akra. You'll find a variety of fritters that bear similar names, similar origins to Nigerian akara. Sometimes the ingredients are different. The main ingredients, so you'll find rice versions instead of, Nigerian and Brazilian bean versions. You find versions with fish and pumpkin, but the names allow us trace these things. We see the similarity as a result. So I think language is a very, very important part of this work with food. Another example, in Nigeria, we have imoyo, which is a broad spectrum of soups, salsas, chunky sauces, and things like that. But I was always confused at how imoyo originated. I was reading a book by Toyin Falola, and it was an exploration of the connection between Nigeria and Brazil. And in the book, they talked about how imoyo connects to Brazilian and Spanish and Portuguese molhos, molho sauces. But if you hear the word molho being pronounced, it sounds very much like imoyo. It doesn't read the same, which, again, is really fascinating. But when I speak with a lot of Nigerians who only know of imoyo in the soup context, they're like, what are you talking about? You don't know what you're talking about. And then you kind of have to do this explanation of how the language is different, how the origins are different. And people often think that we are giving away our ownership of Nigerian culture and cuisine when we ascribe foreign origins or external origins to things. So it's interesting, but there are lots of connections, so many. I recently went to Mexico City and easily within the first few days had found 20 ways that Nigerians and Mexicans had food connections.
Yeah.
It was so fascinating. Of course, I enjoyed eating.
Yeah, I remember when Mexico, I think I was in Mexico in 2017, and then we go into the restaurants in the hotel, and we had this fried plantain. I was like, oh, okay. I mean, that's doodoo right there. Like, I wasn't expecting to see it, but it was interesting. Yeah.
I had a tamale, which is pretty much like moi moi, wrapped in leaves, and then I had something like that was almost exactly like ogi, pap, the smooth cornmeal. And not only were those two things similar, so the tamale, which is like moi moi, and the, what's it called? Atole, which is like ogi. Not only were they similar in appearances, they're also eaten together and also sold early in the morning. So you could see similar practices, similar food combinations. It's just really intriguing.
Okay. I mean, I think so. There's a sort of tension between science and food, right? So science prizes evidence and repeatability, but in addition to those things, food also carries, family memory, oral testimony. I mean, we've been just sort of stuff we've been talking about, leaving traces and all of that. How do you decide what to trust, when you find yourself in the middle of that tension?
That's a good question. I'm not afraid of making mistakes, and I'm not afraid of revisiting things. So I trust myself and my starting point and my desire to learn more. I think for me, science oral history, all of those things, they work together. They're not isolated. They're not distinct, separate pieces that are disparate. They're all part of this mosaic of knowledge, kind of building a sense of what a thing is, where it's been. It's just different lenses of looking at the same thing with the same goal: to know more, to learn more, to bring out the best in whatever it is. So for me, it's part of the multiplicity of ways that I embrace food.
So, I mean, coming to Chop Chop, it's clearly the product of an enormous amount of work. You have
But
100 recipes in
you have to say it right. So it's chop chop,
Chop Chop, sorry.
chop chop. You have to say
Sorry.
it the Nigerian way.
I've lived outside Nigeria for so long. Chop, chop, chop. Yeah, it's clearly the product. Enormous amount of work. And I'll confess something. When I saw the book available on pre-order, I thought, oh, that's a bit expensive, But I mean, when the book came, I was like, okay, fair enough. I saw, the quality and you have 100 recipes, done a lot of repeated testing, you standardize ingredients, you've also added the cultural history, which is something we've talked about, and some really, I think of myself as an amateur photographer, and there's just some superb photography in the book. Yeah, so obviously a cookbook is quite a different proposition from a conventional book, right? So, what part of making this book did you find the most difficult? And what did the finished book demand that you had not anticipated when you started it?
A way of thinking. Prior to writing Chop Chop, I was very much a person of absolutes. All Nigerians do this. All Nigerians do that. All Nigerians, it's this way. All Nigerians swallow. Okay, I've never really thought that all Nigerians swallowed swallows. I choose some of them. But there was very much, I know a lot about Nigerian cuisine, and that's what I'm going to share. The process humbled me, shattered my confidence in many ways, and rebuilt it block by block in a more empathetic, more considerate, and more human way. I see that as I know a lot, but I don't know everything, and I'm open to learning. That was my stance. It wasn't easy, but I had my blog, my Kitchen Butterfly blog, and writing I had done, in the 15 years prior. That was a very, very good base and foundation for me. I felt like it had to be done. Nigerian cuisine is so delicious, and I eat for a living, and I'm forever thinking about food. When I'm eating, when I'm not eating, I'm consumed with food. Nigerian food is stand out delicious. And I needed to make sure that for posterity's sake, we had this compilation that was thorough enough to introduce a newcomer to what Nigerian cuisine was about, but also with enough gems for Nigerians. So this book for me had to be one for Nigerians first and foremost. A kind of record of our collective Nigerianness, a celebration of our love for the food and cuisine, in a way that scholars, my children, my nieces and nephews, my family members and friends, Nigerian and non-Nigerian, could embrace.
Yeah.
That was my goal, and I'm thrilled that I got a publisher to see the vision and put money behind it. And the photographs are done by my friend James Ransom, who's been my friend for 14, 15 years. And believed in the book even before it had a name. And with that, I was really able to capture what I think of as the beauty of Nigeria and Nigerian food in that kind of context.
Yeah. I mean, what recipe or section caused you the most trouble? And, and what would a reader never guess, took so much work, you know?
I tried it was the suya recipe. Not the suya recipe itself, but the yajinkuli spice blend.
Right.
Now, there were a couple of things that I learned which surprised me. So, growing up, when I wanted suya, I'd go to my suya man, buy suya. He would give us a few packs of suya spice. I would take it home. We would dip the suya in it. And whatever was left over, we would use to make BTEC suya or, add to noodles and things like that. And so I thought I knew how the spice blends from suya came about. What I didn't realize was that there are two distinct spice blends used in making suya. One for marinating the meat, and then one for serving with the cooked meat. I only thought that there was the yajinkuli, the one I would get from the suya man at the end. I thought that was the thing for the whole recipe. And I was speaking to a friend of mine, Hawa Darti Gaba, and she was like, she helped me test some of my recipes. And she gave me feedback, and she was like, yeah, in the north, we don't really put kuli in the yaji that we're going to use to season the meat. I'm like, sorry, what? I've been making suya for 10 years. I've written recipes about, yajinkuli as the main blend. And so what I also realized as part of the process is that I can have national food knowledge about Nigerian foods,
but the local
regional, local knowledge trumps. And that's been a huge learning, not making assumptions, learning to ask even when you think you know, which is a very, very hard thing to recognize, because if you think you know a thing, you're not necessarily in an inquiring state of mind.
Yes. Yeah.
So that has rewired my brain, that I find myself going back to first principles and trying my best to begin from kind of a foundational framework. So just figuring out, because she also said something that fascinated me. She was like, also, when we're making yajinkuli with the kuli, we kind of make it fresh. We're not making it and having it sit in cupboards or fridges or wherever for months on end, because the texture, the freshness of the peanuts disappears. So, yeah. So that suya, it's easy. You get a spice blend, but there's such layered wisdom, knowledge, and practice. And I was thrilled that I got to work with people who were able to understand what I was trying to do with my recipes and provide that kind of specific feedback and guidance.
So, I mean, the book has now received the James Beard Foundation's Emerging Voice in Books Award and a Gold Nautilus Book Award. So does this make you think that the wider world is now kind of like ready to understand Nigerian food? And, or what do people still fundamentally misunderstand about Nigeria? I think the last few years have been kind of good. Well, here in the UK, at least, Nigerian food, I tell people, Nigerian food is having a moment. Every time I go to one of the newish or what you might call upscale Nigerian restaurants now, I find out that Nigerians are probably in the minority, typically 20-30%. And, everyone else is just non-Nigerian. So, do you think that, that there's something going on in terms of Nigerian food making its proper world debut?
Huh. I think racism and colonialism are still well and alive. And I don't say that lightly. I think that their perceptions of certain cuisines and culture that people are not even, some people are not willing to even overcome them just yet. Yes, Nigerian culture and cuisine is having a moment, but Nigerian culture and cuisine has been instrumental for centuries. If you look at the cuisine of the American South and across the Black Atlantic, the Caribbean islands, in South and Central America, African, West African, Nigerian cultural practices, traditions, foodways are alive and well, and in some cases have defined the tastes and flavors. So it does feel a bit odd to say it's having a moment when it has been instrumental for centuries, but it is having a moment. What I'm hoping, and I'm really grateful for these awards because they speak they speak the same tune that I'm singing, and that is Nigerian cuisine is worth considering. What I'm hoping is that people continue to open themselves up to seeing all of the ways Nigerian culture and cuisine is similar to their own culture and cuisine. There is a lot to bridge our differences through similar dishes and drinks. My desire is that people continue to see all of these ways that we're similar in spite of our differences, embrace them, and be willing to learn more about Nigerian culture and cuisine. There are also things that we as Nigerians can do, support the work, promote it, but also explore beyond even books, right? I'm thinking documentaries, I'm thinking artists, I'm thinking exhibitions, I'm thinking conversations like this that continue to showcase the deliciousness of the cuisine. Nigerians like Nigerian food, will seek it out wherever they go.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that we yet have the might behind promoting it outside of corporate, outside of fast-moving consumer goods. I want to see like everyday Nigerians not abusing people who are using Nigerian ingredients in new ways. I know the amount of insults I've received on Twitter and in other places when I've decided that I'm going to use agbalumo for a dessert or for a salad dressing instead of
Yeah.
but I
First
think
they
we have
insult, but the thing is, the first they insult you, and then afterwards, I remember when the restaurant Ikoyi opened here in the
mhm.
UK, and then they came up with this raspberry coated plantain, and people were up in arms, like, no, you must not do plantain or fry plantain like this. But I tried it, and it was nice. I was like, okay, so apparently, and I thought to myself, so there was no mandate from heaven that said you must only make plantain this way. You can actually push out the boat. Yeah.
You
Cool.
can. And there's a lot of possibility. I think it even opens up way more possibilities for us. And it's not that we're saying out with the old, let's ditch the traditional. It's like, let's have a larger playing field where we're enjoying this thing in ways that we haven't even ever envisaged.
Yeah. Do you think that does international recognition, like the awards you've gotten, does it put a pressure on you to speak for all Nigerian food?
Does it? I don't feel any pressure.
Okay.
And that might also be because I'm 50. I turned 50 a few days ago. I'm not a baby
Oh,
anymore.
congratulations.
I've got
happy.
gray hair, and
Uh,
and I think I don't feel pressure. I've always loved Nigeria, will always love Nigeria. Celebrating Nigerian food is my calling. And I feel the pressure is more like I want to sell more books. so that, that's the real pressure. One, so that, I earn out my advance and start getting royalties. But perhaps it'll also make way for people who have different ideas about expressing themselves, their Nigerianness, and just making space for the breadth of it all. So pressure, but not to. I can't speak for all Nigerians. I'm just one Nigerian who grew up in Warri and lived in Lagos and spent time in Port Harcourt. Yeah, I'm just gonna do what I can. Also, I don't want to be on the receiving end of Nigerian ire when people are like, "Who are you to speak for us?" And so, yeah.
It's not fun. Yeah. Okay. I mean, my final question, right? So, in the preface to Chop Chop, you write about gathering the children around you, not only to cook and eat Nigerian food, but to learn its history and heritage. So imagine a young Nigerian opens your work 50 years from now, just the way you opened the Kudeti book, right? So, somebody on a podcast 50 years from now, what is the one thing about Nigerian food and, about the people who made it that you most want them not to have forgotten? Like, what message do you want to make sure it carries on for as long as possible?
A love for the cuisine and the food. I included a recipe for soaking gari. And somebody on Reddit, a Nigerian, lambasted me. Can you imagine? They're selling this book for this amount of money and they included a recipe for gari. Why did I do that? My children were raised pretty much in the Netherlands. And I remember the first time I handed my son an agbalumo to eat, he didn't know where to bite the fruit. He had no idea how to open the agbalumo by pressing the top, sucking the juice, then speak. He had no idea because most of the agbalumo he had eaten, I had processed. So they would just go into the freezer, grab some of the already processed flesh. My son didn't know how to eat a piece of an agbalumo fruit. He bit it from the side. And I was like, no, I have to. We take a lot for granted.
Yeah.
We take that. People, regardless of where they've grown up, how they've been raised, know how to be Nigerian. But sometimes you have to learn how to be from a culture. And I hope that Chop Chop, the stories and the words show people what it was to be like up till 2025 as Nigerians, what Nigerian food consisted of. A friend of mine, Fumi, reached out to me and she was laughing about something she read in Chop Chop. It was in my recipe for dodo. I mean, who would even think of including a recipe for dodo? We all know how to fry plantain.
You just fry it.
But not everyone knows how to fry plantain.
Yeah.
Or not everyone knows how to fry plantain the way that Nigerians fry plantain. Because I've eaten plantain abroad and people have shallow fried plantain in a pan with a lick of oil and it hasn't been that dodo. Anyway, Fumi read, because I wrote about it, how a very Nigerian thing to do when you're preparing to fry plantain is you cut the plantain and you season it, but you kind of eat a few bits of this raw plantain before it goes into the oil. And if you're not careful, actually, very few plantain pieces will actually be fried compared to what you've eaten. But she was like, she would never have expected to find that kind of almost inner caucus practice. It's just a very, very casual thing. So for me, it's like, I want people to see habits, the norms that Nigerians expressed, in historic, what will be historic times for them.
All right. What are you doing next?
Woo, woo, woo. What about, okay. I spent the last 5 years as a food and tourism studies professor at a post-secondary college, but had to take severance back in April. So I'm currently job hunting. But I'm thinking of my next book projects. I am working on some jollof rice research to answer the question of how Nigerian jollof has changed over the last 120 years. I'm using cookbooks and recipes in a recipe biography approach, almost like carbon dating, where I'm looking at records and what each record tells me as I map how the character of Nigerian jollof has changed through time. So that's a big project I've been working on started it in 2018, kind of put it to one side. There was a resurgence of my work with it last year into early this year, and I have a 3,000-word essay feature piece coming out in Vittles, which is a UK-originated magazine that distributes globally. So I'm working on jollof. I'm doing some research about Danish butter cookies in tins because
I'm looking forward to what you find on
I'm
that.
fascinated
Now,
about
because you
that.
piqued my interest on that now, yeah.
And then I'm working on some food and drink exhibitions that shows how Nigerian cuisine is connected to other cuisines across the world through ingredients, through utensils, and things like that.
Brilliant. Thank you. That was a really fun conversation. Thank you very much. And for viewers and listeners, I'm holding up the book again. It is a fantastic book. I assure you, once you open it, you understand what I'm talking about. The care and the effort that went into it was really good. Also, thank you again for coming on Frontier Matters, and look forward to hearing from you on whatever you do next. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate taking the time and the thoroughness to ask me questions that have made me reflect and hopefully share some of my thoughts. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.